All right, wonderful. We're live now, and let me get all of us, the three of us, on screen and say good morning to everybody who is watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and also listening to us in Clubhouse. It is March the 20th. This is the spring equinox day here in Japan and everywhere, I believe. So thank you very much for being with us, Japan Expert Insights. Today we have a guest who is going to talk about something we have never talked about before. It is along the lines of culture. And as you have seen our visual, the starting visual, we're going to talk about Shakuhachi and how Linus Callahan came to Japan and is discovering tradition in modern Japan nowadays. So, Linus, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us. I
Thank you
would
for having
like to give you as much time as possible to talk about your experience here. Of course, introduce yourself a little bit first and tell us why you decided to come to Japan and what you're doing here and why. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm an American. I came to Japan about a year and a half ago, but I started the process of the desire to come to Japan back in the 1980s when I was a teenager. I was involved in the martial arts, and from that, I sort of became interested in Buddhism and became a Buddhist in my 20s. And that's where I sort of stumbled onto the Shakuhachi flute. And the flute is connected to the Fuke sect of Buddhism and the mendicant monks that played the shakuhachi asking for alms. And it was a fascinating sort of romantic idea of mine when I was in my late teens and early 20s to come to Japan and give up all my worldly possessions and wander around with a basket hat and asking for alms. Don't actually do that anymore, but that was what I wanted. And I started sort of fooling around with what shakuhachi I could lay my hands on back then. But of course, we didn't have all the technological advantages we have now. And it was very hard to find a teacher in the United States. And I lived in the middle of the United States, Iowa, very remote. And the instruments, you could get them shipped to you, but we didn't really know what we were doing with them. And so I kind of fooled around with shakuhachi back in my 20s, and then came back to it in the last 5 years and started really a serious pursuit of it with a teacher online, and was able to take lessons first, by Skype, and then eventually the opportunity came for my wife and I to move to Japan, a job opportunity for her. And we came here and I studied more directly with my teacher who lives in Nara. And I've there are levels within the shakuhachi world, licenses they call them, and I am just on the edge of getting my Jun Shihan license, which is an assistant instructor license. And it's been quite a journey from the kind of anime and samurai movie idea of what playing the flute is and what it actually is. It's actually a very, very serious classical instrument to approach to play it well. So.
Oh, that's quite a journey. Yeah, I mean, we keep coming back to this theme about Japan's soft power, and
Yes.
sometimes we all, like, I think many of us, we acknowledge on the one hand the power of pop culture, anime, but we also point out that it's not necessarily representative of the reality, but it's still a gateway into the culture. You know what I mean? And just the idea that there's so much interest in Japan warms my heart, because back in the 80s when I actually lived here, it really wasn't that way. There weren't that many of us who were like into the culture, learning the language. We were kind of a rare, the Japanese would say jokingly, henna gaijin, strange foreigner. And they meant it in a complimentary way, right?
Sure.
So it just warms my heart to see how much it's changed just in a generation or two, where Japan has this beautiful, soft image, and part of your journey, for whatever reason, got you into Japan as well, right? And you can acknowledge that the anime side of it is,
Yeah, I came to anime a little bit later. What actually caught me was, I was doing karate and judo and kendo,
gotcha.
and I became, and Iaido as well, and I became interested in just the whole samurai idea.
Yeah.
And I was a Japanophile, but it wasn't anime or manga that caught me. It was
martial arts.
It was Akira Kurosawa. It was those
interesting. Yeah.
Samurai, Ron, movies like that totally cemented my interests. And having Japanese teachers in the United States, a Japanese judo instructor and kendo teacher, that both were Japanese. They were both professors at universities who had come to the U.S. to teach. And they were a huge influence on me as well in my late teens, early 20s. The flute itself, it was sort of, I heard it in the films, but I didn't really understand what I was hearing. And as a child, I played Western flute. My very first instrument was transverse Western flute, and which led to, I played saxophone and oboe and a lot of other woodwinds. Kind of at a middling level, I was never first chair, but I was never last chair. I was always just kind of an also ran in high school band with the instruments. And so it wasn't too hard for me to make a sound on the shakuhachi when I finally got one in my hands, but to actually play it as it's intended to be played is definitely a process. It requires sort of one-on-one instruction. It's not an instrument that you're likely to teach yourself.
That's interesting. So you need an instructor.
Because in essence, it's very much like, blowing over the end of a Coke bottle, right? It's there's nothing, there are no moving parts. So this is the end of the instrument, and there's no reed. There are no keys. There's no moving parts. It's basically just a tube. So if you can make a sound on an empty Coke bottle, you can probably make a sound on a shakuhachi. But to then shape that sound and make it into something musical is quite a process.
Yeah. And it seems like one of those things that are difficult to put into words, to say what sound are you looking for. You have to hear it almost, but that, to me, that's just so interesting.
And Western flutes, the transverse flute is generally nowadays they're made of metal. There are still wooden flutes out there, of course, but they're made of metal, and they're engineered to give you a very sort of similar tone throughout the range of the instrument, so that your low notes and your high notes have a very similar sort of tonal quality. And the shakuhachi is organic. It's made of bamboo. All of them, even the finest professionally made instruments, are unique. Each instrument kind of has its own quirks. And when you pick up a new instrument, you have to sort of develop a relationship with it, because each instrument's a little different.
Right. What are some of the challenges that you have had or overcome to get the tone you're trying to achieve? Is it a process? Are you still on your way up? How would you describe that challenge?
Well, the instrument is affected by weather and by temperature and humidity. And so one of the real challenges for me, I don't have perfect pitch, but I have pretty strong relative pitch. So if I have a reference pitch, I'm pretty good at telling where I'm at in terms of being sharp or flat. And it can be very frustrating because the instrument is frequently, it's cold outside or the humidity is very low, and you find that you're very flat or you're very sharp. And a lot of the repertoire is a solo repertoire, so it doesn't really matter as long as you're in tune with yourself. But when you're trying to play with other instruments, there's a sort of whole body of music called sankyoku, which is intended for shakuhachi, shamisen, and koto to play together.
Right.
The koto players, they're in tune, right? They can tune their instruments and be in tune. The shakuhachi player is constantly trying to adjust your embouchure to get to be in tune with the string players. And for someone who has pretty good ear, it can be very frustrating. Sometimes I pick up my instrument first thing in the morning and blow the basic note on the instrument. The 1.8 is a concert D. I play and I can just hear it. I'm like 25 cents flat. And you have to warm the instrument up. You have to warm yourself up. You have to get your energy up. You have to find the right angle for your embouchure to be closer to that concert pitch. Or let it go. Just play what the instrument wants to play. And that can be hard if you're a Western musician and you've had it sort of what the pitch is supposed to be.
So in a sense, you're singing through the instrument, in a sense.
Yeah, because one of the things that really attracted me to the instrument is that it is so vocal. It's very similar in range to a woman's voice. And so it's in a way, it's similar to a Western instrument that you see in the recorder family. They have an instrument called the voice flute, and it's pitched to be basically right there in the soprano and alto range. And it has a lot of expressive capabilities that are similar to the human voice. And it's definitely one of the things that makes shakuhachi stick with people. When you hear it in a film score, you might not know what the instrument is, but it definitely catches you. And you're like, what is that?
Yeah. Wow. Maya, your mic's muted.
Okay. Apologies for this. But then, what is interesting to me, and you mentioned that this instrument is very organic. So there are no moving parts. It's just a tube with holes that help you create the sounds and different tones and everything.
Right.
And I was thinking, so my thoughts went into entirely different direction. And that this direction is about Japanese cooking and Japanese cuisine. How most of the food and most of the dishes here actually try to present, or to let's say to show the taste of the ingredient as it is.
Sozaino.
So, because in Western cuisine, for example, we like to add herbs and spices, right? And to actually, hopefully, let's say, mute some of the unpleasant tastes, or strengthen them, right? But in the Japanese cuisine, it's never the case. So they try to to give you the taste of that sosai, of the ingredient. And it sounds to me, it's very close to what shakuhachi, the concept of shakuhachi is. You basically have to use what is available there for you and get the best out of it. And of course, as Tim said, basically you're singing through the instrument, but it is still an instrument, which is a fascinating concept.
Yeah. Simple but deep. It's like they take something really simple, but they go really deep into it. The nuances is where it is, That's
I agree. It's definitely in that presentation of nature that in our solo repertoire, many of the pieces are intended to be representative of elements of nature. there's a lot of sounds that we make that are supposed to sound like they're described to the student as, oh, it's supposed to sound like wind blowing through the bamboo leaves, or
Right.
it's to sound like the ocean, or it's to sound like birds on the water, and the flapping of wings and that sort of thing. And so a whole lot of our repertoire, like we joke about it sometimes, that a lot of our repertoire is it's water, it's the moon, it's birds, it's frogs, it's insects.
Yeah.
And there's many songs that are sort of geared towards creating, it's an evening, you're by the water, and there's natural sounds, and that's sort of what you're trying to evoke with those pieces.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of pieces that are sort of in the modern repertoire where they sound a little more like a Western flute, but they still will occasionally add these elements to sort of keep it true to the, for lack of a better word, to the diction of shakuhachi, to the sort of vocabulary of shakuhachi. And you end up with it can sound a lot like a Western flute in the hands of a really skilled player, but then every once in a while you get these bursts of sound that are very natural and very organic mixed in with it. And I think it's what makes the shakuhachi unique from Western flute.
Yeah.
Would shakuhachi be difficult for somebody who, let's say, just can't carry a tune?
Well,
have problems. I won't mention any names.
Well, it's an instrument that has a huge solo repertoire, and so if you're in tune to yourself, you're fine. And in fact, we have shakuhachi nowadays. Modern shakuhachi are sort of matched up to the Western scale. So, like the traditional shakuhachi, the 1.8 is like in the key of D. The bass note that it plays is a D. And then when you go to smaller instruments, like this is a 1.4, it's going to have a higher bass pitch. And then we have much larger instruments, like this is a 2.1, and it has a lower bass pitch. And these are we say it's a D or it's an F or whatever, but on any given day, it's going to be off. It's going to be flat or sharp. And there are also instruments that are sort of not made to match the Western scale, that are more raw sounding. And they don't have a finished bore. This bore is finished with lacquer and paste to make it a more perfect bore. But some instruments, they leave the bore unfinished, and you get a much more raw, much more organic sound, the sound of the bamboo. And many of those are not matched to a Western pitch. So rather than like a 1.9 or 1.8, you'll see 1.95, which is not a Western pitch. It's just somewhere in there. And you can play those instruments by themselves and just experience what they have to offer without worrying too much about being exactly in pitch.
That's an interesting answer, because it's like if you're in tune to yourself.
Yeah.
That's like Japanese soul, like there's that spiritual dimension to it. As long as you're in your realm being real, it can work.
Yeah.
The instrument also, there's a lot of people who are scholars of the instruments can speak at great length on the different, how the tunings have changed, because all the flutes that you would buy today from a reputable maker are sort of in tune with Western scales. But when you look at older instruments, they're frequently a little strange in their intervals.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll have a note that is exceedingly sharp or very far off from what you're used to hearing. And that was traditional at the time that instrument was made. So if you play an instrument that's 200, 300 years old, they're going to have a slightly different idea of what that note should be. And it can be a little jarring to the Western player because the 1.8 is tuned to a pentatonic scale, a D pentatonic. And if you have a pretty good idea of what that's supposed to sound like, if you're a guitar player or piano player, you expect to hear D, G, or D, F, G, A, C.
Yeah.
And when you
Yeah.
play up that scale and it's the third note or the fourth, like the A is frequently way off. It's an A sharp. And what? It sounds wrong. It's not wrong. It's just that's the voice of that instrument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've been playing. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Maya.
Oh, no, I wanted to say that also to me, it sounds like, Tim, what you said, it is the Japanese soul. It sounds like the Japanese soul, finding the harmony with yourself. And so, but I also think that it is maybe a way of also discovering who you are in a way. Am I thinking too deep here?
No,
I don't know.
I think that like my instructor would love that. He would love to hear that. There's a real push once you've got the basics down. There's a push to kind of find your own voice and find the way you like to play, and it's hard to describe. But if you listen to the masters, both living, well, the 20th century masters, the ones who've been recorded, if you listen to them and you put in the time learning their individual voices, you can listen to any random piece of shakuhachi music and say, oh, this person sounds like Aoki Rebo, or this person sounds like Kakizakai.
Yeah.
And in fact, now that I've been listening to it pretty intensely for the last 4 or 5 years, I can oftentimes hear a piece and say, oh, that's Kakizakai. And then go looking. Yeah, it is. I finally have learned their voices enough that I can identify them just by the way they play, and they could be playing the same piece.
Yeah. You said each instrument is different, and in a very, from my standard and most people's standard in the West, it's a radical difference. But even like I have a Takamine guitar, okay?
Sure.
And every guitar, even mass-produced guitars, they're all a little bit different. They play a little bit different. They got just a slightly different sound. I mean, you're using different. So even something mass-produced with Japanese, craftsmanship quality, you still see a difference. And that's why I would never buy a guitar off the internet. I got to go like sit down with it and play it,
Yeah.
And so even that is true. So most people who play anything understand that. But in your case, it's much more radically different. And the weather affects guitars too, but not to the degree of a shakuhachi. So
Sure.
that's, and then the other thing about, being in tune with yourself and finding your own voice, it's almost like even before that, you got to kind of have a sense of who you are anyway as a human being, right? And I'm a late bloomer. I'm still discovering who I am. But I'm getting closer to, oh, that's me. But it's been a journey, and I wonder if maybe that the shakuhachi is one way to facilitate that journey, and in a musically expressive way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And to contrast it with guitars or piano, something that most people have a little better idea of, if your piano is going flat, you have a technician come in and tune it up. If your guitar has gone wildly off, you yourself can set the intonation, right? You can check at the 12th fret and get everything synced up. There's nothing to set.
Right.
There's nothing to fix, and
Right.
You can take your instrument to a skilled maker and have them move the holes a tiny bit, or have them sort of shape out the holes to change pitches a little bit. But really, it's on the player. And because the instrument doesn't have any keys or anything, when you're covering the holes, the way you cover the hole and how much of the hole you cover, because some notes require you to partially cover a hole like this to get your chromatic notes in between. So it's your finger and the shape of your finger and how some people roll a finger up like this or they go like that, and how much of the hole you cover shades the sound. And you can also not cover the hole, but just sort of hover your finger over it, which will flatten a note just slightly. And so there's a lot of nuance to how you generate sound. And it's, like I say, it's you and the bamboo kind of creating something together that is ultimately completely unique. It's not going to sound like everyone else. It's a great frustration when you have a teacher that you admire and you want to sound like your teacher.
Yeah. Right.
You're not playing his flute and you're not him. So you're not going to sound like him.
Yeah. Yeah. You gotta sound like you.
Right.
You know, and this is kind of tangentially related, I think, but as Maya said, you have to adapt to the reality, whatever it is, of that day, that weather, that shakuhachi.
Sure.
And I think in a strange way, it reflects the resourcefulness of the Japanese. And when I say resourcefulness, it's kind of counterintuitive, but cultures that are resource starved or have, you know, fewer natural resources are by necessity required to be resourceful.
Right.
And, you know, people with an abundance of resources, you don't have to be that resourceful. You're going to waste a lot. There's going to be that tendency. So I feel like almost this is just a reflection of that. Like, whatever you have, you got to deal with it and make the best of it and be real and play it the way, you know, only you can play it. So that's a beautiful sentiment. Wow.
And the instrument has changed over the centuries quite a bit. The instrument that it's based on is a Chinese flute called the zhao. The zhao has more finger holes, and it also has holes sort of down near the bottom that are for resonance, that are not, they're just left open all the time. And that was introduced to Japan back in the 700s. And that gave rise to an instrument called the Kodai Shakuhachi, which was the ancient shakuhachi, and it had more holes than the current shakuhachi, and was of a very different sort of thickness and weight. And as we've moved forward in time, the shakuhachi has gotten sort of heavier and thicker. And the Fuke shakuhachi, the one we play today, is a very dense, very heavy instrument. And all of those evolutions were moving in the direction of making it more resonant, louder, a wider range, almost 3 octaves for most players, and giving it that ability to be flexible. And we kept getting rid of finger holes. We're down to 4 now. So it's made it more and more an instrument that you can make your own, that you can play in your own way.
Interesting. Yeah, there was a lot. That's when the culture was coming into Japan from China. Shotoku Taishi, right? He bringing in Buddhism, like actively importing those cultural concepts. So it makes sense that that's when it came in.
Yeah, initially during Edo period, and it was very popular, and then it sort of faded from popularity for a while, and then kind of was reborn in the 15th century. And the flutes that we play today there was a very small flute that is related to the shakuhachi that kind of, it was very popular for a short period of time and then died out completely. And it was replaced eventually by this flute, the Fuke flute. And they're related, but they're wildly different. The smaller flute has a voice that's much more like a recorder. It's much more bird-like than the shakuhachi. And the shakuhachi is an instrument that kind of, when you play in the lower ranges, it can be very loud and can push more in the direction almost of being like a clarinet or a saxophone sound. And that evolution that brought us to this instrument, I think, was driven to some extent by materials that were available
Right.
and just by people's changing tastes and what they wanted out of the instrument.
Wow. Interesting.
The reason we call it today, the reason it's called the shakuhachi, is it refers to the old measurement system of Japan, the shaku. And so it was one shaku and 8
8
sun.
holes.
Yeah, so 1.8 feet, which
2.0.
even though we call them all shakuhachi, they vary in length quite a bit now. There's down to like 1.1, which is quite small and quite high pitched. And I think the biggest one I've ever seen was like a 3.6, quite large, very, very low. The longer the instrument gets, the harder they are to play because there's no keys. So you have to be able to reach those bottom holes.
That would be hard. Yeah.
My teacher plays the 3.0, and it's quite. I can't even cover the holes. I can't even get my hand down down to the bottom of it to cover the holes. So you're limited to some extent by your wingspan.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I'm done. I'm like one of those dinosaurs almost.
I kind of specialize in the smaller flutes. I really prefer these little guys. I joke around with my fellow students that the big appeal of these is that they're cheap.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
A 1.4 costs a lot less than a 3.4. So.
Just a side note, unrelated, but D is like usually I play in D a lot because that's most songs fit my range in D, but not every song, of course. But so it's interesting that I didn't know it was tuned to D, or that was a D. So
yeah,
wow.
and that's with the instruments today, the 1.8 is usually between 21 and 22 inches long in imperial measurement, which is 54 centimeters, and with you'll occasionally see flutes, like handmade flutes from hobbyists, that are that size, that play a radically different note, and it has to do with the thickness of the bamboo. But generally, if you have a piece of bamboo that's roughly this size and you just cut and what we call utaguchi, the song mouth, if you just cut that diagonal on the top of it and blow over it like a Coke bottle, you're going to get something close to a D.
I see. To me, it sounds, because I have no education in music and no experience actually of playing any musical instruments. It's like a foreign language.
Yeah, and the instrument is very like, it definitely is not like a Western flute where the Western flute's made of metal, and if it's not in tune, you can slip the head joint in and out to get closer to the pitch you want. The only thing you can do is change your angle. So by how you dip your head up and down, you can make it flat or sharp.
Yeah.
And now this sounded like the wind to me. I think the mountains, in a forest. Yeah.
Right. I didn't cover anything. That's just the sound. That's just the sound of the instrument with nothing covered. Covering the holes.
Yeah.
And I'm not really mic'd up to have a good presentation of sound here, but that's sort of the base pitch of the 1.8, sort of a D4 for those who speak music.
Yeah.
On the guitar,
the D, because that's a D. Not that I didn't believe you, but I just want.
I'm probably a little flat. It's early in the morning, but
yeah, I get it. I get it.
Well, but also while you were explaining how the instrument came to Japan and it was different from what it is now, and how the Japanese continued to actually, let's say, improve it. Yes. So it's, once again, it is, to me, I just can see how what's that yearning, or what's that, people here, they really want to make things better. the Kaizen spirit and that willingness to get things and even just a little bit better, the incremental improvements and everything else. It is so, I don't know. I mean, I could hear it while you were
Yeah.
talking about how they change or they continue maybe changing the instrument even nowadays.
Yeah, and as part of that aspiration, they also want to fit it to their needs, their
Yeah.
culture. So it's sometimes better. Things tend to get better, but there's that aspiration to Japanize it, to make it fit their values, fit their sentiments, which is also interesting. Everything you can look at everything. Buddhism, same thing. they Japanize Buddhism to fit their needs, right?
Sure. And with the instrument, it's become in the 20th century, it's become fairly common to see shakuhachi that are not made of bamboo, that are sort of modern materials. There's people making them out of ebonite. There are people making them out of hardwoods and actually boring them out. There are people even in 3D printed ABS, PVC instruments, and they have the advantage of not being as reactive to the environment. And, I don't want to take a several $1,000 shakuhachi and hand it to my 6-year-old and say, here, go learn that,
Yeah.
But if I have a PVC flute that I can hand to her and say, go for it, go play.
Yeah.
And so there's even that is still the envelope is being pushed forward. One of the real, like we were talking earlier, the limitation of having the very long flutes is that you have to be able to reach those holes. But
Right.
if you 3D print the flute, there's no reason that it needs to be straight. It can be curly.
Oh.
So you can make the flute into like an S shape and have a 3.5 that's condensed into a much smaller space. And the finger holes wouldn't be further down. They're just going to be over on the curve. So you could get the finger holes up closer to the player. And that's sort of that's the very edge of the shakuhachi envelope right now. There are several people that are working on making coiled shakuhachi so they can play very deep instruments without having to like hurt your shoulders to play them.
Interesting.
Yes.
Now, to be fair, I haven't heard one of those that sounded good yet. but the prototype instruments are out there. They're working on it. They got some bugs to work out still, but I think in the near future we'll see some artificial material instruments that have some pretty good sound.
Yeah. And Linus, I also would like to hear how you started learning. Did you find a teacher in the United States first, or did you learn by yourself first, or what is the learning process for you?
Well, back in the 80s, we didn't have the benefit of the internet quite as much. And so I did find a flute maker in the United States and ordered kind of a beginner grade flute when I was about 20 years old. And I played Western flute, so I was able to make a sound on it, and I was able to sort of play up through the natural notes on the instrument. When it got to flats and sharps, I really struggled. I had books and manuals that explained it, but there was not even a lot of recorded material to listen to at that time that was tutorial. You could hear performances, but to get a tutorial in a tape recording or something was very rare. And so, like I say, I sort of fiddled around with it, just played with it, and used it almost more as a meditative thing. There is a tradition in Zen, Fuke Zen, of what they call suizen, just blowing Zen, and sort of holding the low note on the instrument as long as you can. The traditional time period that's recommended, one of the great players of the 20th century, Watazumi Dozo, said, if a man will play Ro, the bass note on the instrument, for 10 minutes every day, he can become a master. And so I used to do that, used to sort of use it as a breathing meditation and just play the low note on the instrument for as long as I could, take another breath, and do it again, and do that for about 10 minutes. It's really good for your tone production. It's really good for your lungs. not great for your marital relations. Because nobody wants to listen to the same note for 10 minutes. So, I think a lot of shakuhachi players got to go out in the garage to do their suizen, but I did that. And then when I started seriously playing the instrument, I was living in Vietnam, and I discovered my teacher online and started taking lessons on Skype. And ironically, he was at the time living in the United States. So there was time differences that had to be adjusted. So sometimes my lessons were at weird times, but he now lives in Nara, and so it's much easier. But I still take my primary lessons by Skype. I see him in person a few times a year, but I see him on Skype every week. And, in fact, I have a lesson shortly after we're done here.
Right. Yes, and Linus, you also mentioned that you have you have come very close to getting your license here, and there are different levels of licenses, so you already have some of them. And I also know from Rebecca, your wife, that you just started your lesson or giving lessons to people who want to learn. And congratulations on that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that as well?
Well, thank you. My teacher just authorized me to take students, and I am trying to approach the shakuhachi in a sort of less mystical way. There's a lot of sort of impediment, I think, for some people, especially Japanese people, because they associate the shakuhachi with this mendicant monk mystical kind of experience. And yes, there is that element to it, but at the end of the day, it's a musical instrument. You have to practice, you have to learn the basics, you have to learn good posture, good embouchure, good hand position, that sort of thing. It's just like the piano or the violin or any other instrument you would approach. And so my take on teaching the instrument is to talk about nuts and bolts first. After you've been playing for a while, if you want to delve into it, you want to become a meditative player, and you want to make this your pathway to oneness or whatever. I'm totally supportive of that. But let's play the scale first. Let's get the basics down. Let's play a song. Let's play Hinamaru and have people recognize it. Let's play basic musical skills first before we delve into all the mystique of the instrument. And so I definitely take a beginner's approach to the instrument.
Beginner mind, I love it. That's the essence of humility. And many of our listeners and viewers, many of them really understand Japan, and many of them understand. Therefore, they understand that a teacher authorizing an apprentice or a student to teach, that's a big deal. So hats off to you. That's an achievement. And it's not easy to please a Japanese teacher, and I mean that in a good way. I mean, because they push you, and if they really love you, they really push you because they know you can get the most out of it.
Yeah.
And I also like that you demystify. We need more people demystifying stuff. But so starting with basics, tackling the nuts and bolts, I love it. So go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and let me clarify too. My instructor is actually an American.
Yeah.
But
okay. Interesting.
He was originally a violinist and violist, and came into playing the shakuhachi while he was, in conservatory, and eventually moved away from the stringed instruments and became a shakuhachi player specialist. He has like a Western conservatory education, but he's also a grandmaster shakuhachi player. And
well, not me for assuming. So that's my bad.
No, I mean my instructor is American, but he is married to a Japanese woman, lives in Nara, fluent in Japanese, and is very, very well versed in sort of the aesthetics of the instrument and also of all the sort of trappings that go along with it. Shakuhachi is frequently associated with like tea ceremony, for example, or associated with temple music, and he's very well versed in that. And his training began with Japanese masters. So he's, I think, even though he's a Westerner and he speaks English, he conveys the instrument in a very sort of true to the tradition fashion.
Beautiful.
And it's interesting that currently the shakuhachi seems to have a lot of adherents that are foreign. Although there are many great Japanese masters playing right now, the main sort of growth in the instrument is in Western players. There's a lot of people in America, a lot of people in Europe that are picking up the instrument and becoming very adamant about it. And you don't, I had, in my experience, my brief time in Japan, I have not encountered a lot of Japanese players that are just getting started, but there's thousands and thousands of players that are just getting started in the United States. So
you mentioned offline when we were talking that a lot of the Japanese youngsters don't even know what a shakuhachi is, and that indicates lack of interest, right? So hopefully there's something that can be promoted, to keep the tradition alive. Although, Westerners seem like they're trying to do it. Yeah.
One thing that my teacher is doing in his area, in the Kansai region, is he's putting together an elementary school program to get shakuhachis in kids' hands. 4th, 5th grade is a good sort of starting point. Their hands are big enough that they can actually, play an instrument that's not super high pitched. Right. And so he wants to start a program that gets shakuhachi into kids' hands at that age and gets them started. Kind of like if you grew up in America, you may have been handed a recorder when you were in elementary school. Or if you grew up in Canada, they hand you a ukulele in about the 4th grade and get you started that way.
So I think that's a great idea, actually, and maybe working with school boards like Kyoiku Inkai and on local level first with local schools, maybe the way to spread that idea and get more schools involved in the program, because this is one of the many traditions of Japan. And my understanding is that nowadays, or at least it seems that more foreigners are interested in learning how to play shakuhachi than Japanese. And I hope that I'm mistaken, but that's my impression. And definitely these traditions, they don't have to die out, right? So if schools get involved, if they get on board, I believe that there will be a larger population of future shakuhachi players.
Yeah, it's something that my teacher and I have talked about a lot. The idea that, I have 2 children that are in Japanese elementary school now, and it's my relationship with their school. I'm when I go to PTA meetings, as you might guess, I kind of stand out a little bit.
No.
Not really.
the rest of the dads that are there, I'm
shockingly they wanted you to play Santa Claus. I can't believe that.
Right.
And they do that.
I'm happy to do that. I enjoy being Santa as well. I've spoken briefly with my son's principal at his elementary school regarding the idea of bringing shakuhachi to the kids. Initially, even just performances, just showing up and playing for assemblies and things like that. But eventually, I would love to be able to show up with, 30 PVC shakuhachi and hand them out to, 4th, 5th graders and get them started, Right. And it's an instrument that, although like the recorder, I think every parent who's ever had an elementary school kid playing a recorder around the house wishes they weren't, right?
Right.
But because it's very easy to make horrible sounds with the recorder. The shakuhachi it's actually quite hard to play the high notes on a shakuhachi. It's hard to be shrill on the instrument. So
Ah,
it's a little easier on the parents
ah,
to get
good.
them started that way.
Oh,
And there are, like I say, there are 1.4s and 1.6s, which are quite a small instrument. I mean, the spacing on this is very small. And most kids, my 9-year-old can play, he can't make a decent sound, but he can get his fingers on these holes quite easily.
yeah.
And that's sort of the key, is getting them to where their hands are big enough they can actually handle the instrument.
Well, that's great, and I very much hope that this spreads throughout schools, starting from the school of your kids, because we want to see that tradition. I am a foreigner here, but I think that many or all the traditions here we can enjoy are beautiful, and yeah, they need to really stay alive. And
One of
also,
the go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
I was just gonna say one of the attractive features of it, as you mentioned earlier, Linus, was we've all heard about the importance of breathing when you meditate, right?
Right.
And this promotes the proper breathing. It gives you that focal point, and so you're kind of killing two birds with one stone in a
Right.
sense, but it's making it easy to do it. And I think maybe that's part of the attraction with Westerners is because meditation has become more and more popular. The studies have come out how therapeutic it is, and to have something like that to bring you into that mindset seems like there's also a practical in addition to artistic benefit to doing it. Is
Yeah,
that fair?
there's definitely, I mean, the shakuhachi definitely strengthens your lungs. It definitely strengthens you, because as you are trying to hold notes longer and longer, you have to support with your diaphragm, and you also have to kind of use all of your lung capacity. And that's something that a lot of us don't do. A lot of us breathe very slowly,
Yeah.
and we only breathe sort of in the, for lack of a better, this isn't physically accurate, but it's a good way to think of it. We sort of breathe on the top half of our lungs, and we
Yeah.
don't really breathe,
Gotcha.
exhale fully.
Yeah.
And the shakuhachi really pushes you to do that. And there are modern players who, it's amazing. You'll listen to the recording, and they'll start a piece and play for 25 or 30 seconds without taking a breath.
Ooh.
And I'm always amazed. I'm like, where is that coming from?
Yeah.
Some of it has, and these are, men in their 70s, and it's amazing.
Huh.
And sometimes some of it is that they are very skilled players and they make the most of their airstream. They're not wasting any air. But
Right.
also, just years of playing the instrument has given them powerful lung capacity. It's definitely better to breathe deeply and to clear your
Mhm.
lungs as much as you can. And the shakuhachi just sort of, that's compulsory when you're playing the shakuhachi.
Yeah, so there are other benefits from playing shakuhachi, which we don't often think about, but health benefits from that. Because I got a comment in Clubhouse from Hiroko-san, and she wrote, "Well, I just learned that it's so difficult. It's very difficult to play shakuhachi." And my take on this is that maybe because it's so difficult, it is actually fun and it is worth trying, because the satisfaction once you get at a certain level and realize that you're improving, the satisfaction there is much bigger than if it is something easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm reminded of my grandmother, who used to always say, anything that's worth doing is going to be hard at some point, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
If it's always easy, what's the point?
Right. Yeah.
And
Indeed.
with the shakuhachi, I mean, I don't want to scare people off. You can have fun on a shakuhachi and play at an easy level within, most people can make it a pretty recognizably musical sound in a couple of weeks. It's not that hard.
I
But
see.
to push on through the repertoire and play at the higher levels takes practice. It takes some dedication. And I think that one of the things that's lacking in the modern world, because we are so accustomed to the instant gratification of the
Mhm.
internet, um, is that daily practice, having something that you chip away at every
Yeah.
day. And it
Yeah.
is very much like, I think of it almost like carving stone.
Mm.
There's no hurrying. There's no hurrying through that. You can put in your hour or two a day every day for weeks and weeks and weeks, and at the end see the progress. Putting in 8 hours one day, that's not going to get it done.
Right. Right.
Right. So
Right.
there are no shortcuts there. So it takes time, it takes dedication,
I mean,
it
you can
takes.
spend a lot of money on a really nice flute. That's kind of a shortcut.
Okay.
you know,
And Linus, like if anybody, our viewers or someone they know would be interested in studying from you, is there a way they can do that? And do you have a contact?
yeah,
How should they contact you?
they can find me on Facebook, and
Mm-hmm.
my Facebook page it's kind of a play on words, ESL, English Shakuhachi Lessons. They could find me there,
Okay.
and they could also reach me directly on LinkedIn, for example,
Yeah.
as Linus Callahan. As far as getting instruments are concerned, we do have a relationship with a maker in Tokyo who Yozan made. All my instruments that I play regularly are Yozan made instruments, and he's just a fantastic maker who has a lot of different flutes to offer, and also is very good about sort of accommodating people's interests. If you want longer flutes or shorter flutes, he can, you know, make that happen.
Right.
Yes, so I only wanted to say that the link to your Facebook page, I shared
Mm.
it in House. It is there on top of the page. Also, it is in the description of YouTube, our YouTube video, and I'll share it on LinkedIn as well as soon as we finish this live stream. Also, I have tagged Linus in our post, and you can reach out directly and connect him on LinkedIn. So I do encourage you to do that. And Linus, yes, you are based currently in Kanto, right?
Uh,
Just yeah,
well, we're in Hachioji,
Hachioji. Yes, okay. So
and so, but as far as ongoing lessons are concerned, Skype and Discord have improved their audio quality to the point now
okay,
where it's possible to have a very good, meaningful sort of musical lesson over those media. Um, and also, I am not opposed to, especially for initial lessons. I'm happy to travel within reason in the Tokyo area to bring
right.
shakuhachi to someone so they can have that first experience and see if it's for them.
Great.
That's wonderful. So distance is not a problem when it comes it comes to online lessons, Skype
Right.
and Discord, and then you can travel to people within Kanto so that
Sure.
you can yes
It's
help
negotiable.
yes actually help them start the shakuhachi journey.
And I
Yes.
hope that
Well,
if people have questions, or if they're just, if there's just curiosity out there, that they feel free to
mhm.
contact me. I'm more than happy to try and explain as I know it. And if I don't have the answer, I know who to forward them on to.
Yes. Okay. So Hiroko-san wrote, I would love to try if there is an opportunity. And I'm a swimmer, so I have strong lungs. So Hiroko-san, yes, I do encourage yes to reach out to Linus and talk with him about this because I think it's a beautiful opportunity. I am totally out of playing musical instruments, but while listening to your Linus, I was thinking, why not? Maybe even a person who always sings out of tune may be able to to play
Glad
notes
I
and
asked that question.
it.
I love the absolute beginner who doesn't know anything about music. It's an opportunity to open up sort of a different form of expression for them. But as a
Mhm.
teacher, it's raw clay, right? I can make what I want of that student, and so a person who has no preconceived notions may be the best student of all. So
The blank slate.
that's right.
Right. So especially in my case, I think that first I have to find some confidence, because it has been actually ingrained into me that, this singing out of tune goes in the family. You know?
My wife also is my children ask her to not sing.
Oh no.
But she's actually a very accomplished musician. She plays the viola. She played beautifully.
All
But
right.
she can
Yes.
hear it, but she can't make the pitches with her
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah.
But yeah, not having any musical background is no hindrance because everybody's got to start somewhere. And the shakuhachi is as good a entry point to the world of music as any.
For sure.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much for the first, vote of confidence.
You can get your wabi sabi fix. Your
Right.
your your.
Everything. Yes, indeed. Well, great.
Thank you so much for. I really enjoyed today's conversation. I hope you'll come back in the future. Go ahead,
Thank you
Mike.
for having me.
I wanted to say exactly the same thing, Timothy. Tim, sorry, Tim.
Tim.
Well, and I hope that someone out there is their interest is sparked, and if you want to study with me, that's great. If you're intimidated by Shakuhachi Santa Claus and you want to study with somebody else, that's great. As long as someone has found interest in the Shakuhachi, my mission here is complete.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Linus. And I'm looking forward to having you again with us soon in the
Thank you
near
so much.
future.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks a lot to everybody who stayed with us. We'll be here once again on Sunday morning at 8:20 with Japanese politics, and next week when we'll be talking with Rebecca Callahan about gaming and anime here in Japan. That's all for today. Enjoy the national holiday, the spring equinox.
Have a great day, everyone.